Stones glow in a dark tent. Someone scatters seeds onto the heat. They hiss, and a soft, resinous smoke rises. Outside, frost bites horses' manes. Inside, mourners press cloth to their mouths and inhale, and a low howling begins. Not grief alone, but release. A shoulder loosens, a rib stops shouting. Breath finds rhythm. The same plant rides in saddlebags, rests on clinic shelves, and burns in high mountain cemeteries. Tonight, we follow it across cold grasslands and crowded temples to see how an herb turned into survival, easing pain, lending sleep, and binding people through shared ritual. One grave detail will shift how we read ancient medicine. He rides until the light drains from the sky and the land becomes only chill and sound. The horse's breath steams. The leather creaks. His ribs ache where a winter fall clipped the saddle bow last month. That pain is his weather now, always there, sometimes calm, sometimes gusting. He chooses a stand of low brush as a windbreak and dismounts carefully, one hand to the ribs. From the saddle he unloops a coil of hemp rope and plants a narrow stake by habit, so the gelding won't wander. The animal noses his shoulder, impatient for grain, for rest. He pats the warm neck, then kneels to coax a small fire in a shallow pit, lined with stones he carried in a hide pouch. They hold heat. They've saved his life more than once. The pouch at his belt is tighter, more private. Within it, seeds he knows by feel, smooth and hard, and a twist of brittle flower tops he guards for nights like this. There's no doctor on the step. There's his judgment, his kit, his breath. He waits until the stones hum with stored heat, then shields the little brazier from the wind with his cloak. A pinch of seed goes first, a crackle and a nutty scent. Then a crumb of dried resinous flour pressed between thumb and forefinger, dusted across the stones. Smoke lifts, thin at first, then fuller. He leans close, draws it slow, holds it, lets it go. His horse flicks an ear, then settles. Knee unlocked, weight eased. He has done this before, never carelessly. The first breaths wash the sharpness from his ribs, turning the hard points of pain into something rounder. His jaw unclenches. The winter air is still brutal, but the edge of it blunts. He thinks of last spring's drive when the river ran high and 3 foals found footing and 1 did not. He remembers the send-off in the village tent, stones heating, seeds hissing, the old women keening, the men sitting close, shoulder to shoulder. How the smoke braided grief into something carryable. He takes another slow breath. In the distance, a fox yips, then silence returns, a large, listening quiet. He rubs salve, animal fat and bitter leaves over a bruise on his thigh and feels the heat spread. He knows the bitter herbs calm the skin, but the smoke does the deeper work, not erasing pain, just moving it enough that sleep can find him. There were nights he tried to endure without it. Nights when the wind lifted the tent wall and his mind churned until dawn. On those mornings, small mistakes multiplied, cinch left loose, a knot not checked, a hoof crack missed. Out here, a small mistake grows teeth. So he learned a rhythm. Ride, tend, heat, breathe, sleep. Not every night. Enough. He sets the second watch with his companion, a boy too young to be called man, old enough to ride far. They share the warmth of the brazier for a moment, passing the smoke without words. The boy's shoulders drop, his eyes soften, then widen with the easy awe of altered breath. The man nods. They sit in the low orange light, backs touching the tent poles, listening for hoof sounds, for trouble. His mother called the plant by a name that meant simply hemp, like rope, like cloth. Useful. The old men had other words, heavier with respect. The trader who sold him the seeds once at a summer fair named them in a Silk Road tongue, said the same plant wore priestly robes in cities he would never see. Names are wind. The effect is the same. The body loosens its grip on pain, and the mind stops rehearsing disasters. He thinks of his father, a man who didn't trust anything that made your thoughts drift, who died in a blizzard after pushing through one watch too many. He thinks of the woman who wrapped his ribs last week with a strip of woven hemp, hand steady, voice low, telling him to burn just a little tonight, not much, then sleep. He honored her counsel. He isn't trying to leave the world, only to rest inside it. By the time the stars crown the sky, his breaths have lengthened. Hunger softens into a simple fact. Cold retreats to the edges. He makes a last check of the horse's hobble, tightens a peg, and returns to the low tent. The brazier glows a faint red. He cups it with a pot, letting the smoke thin, conserving what's left. He lies on his side, cradling the tender ribs with one forearm. Sleep comes the way a patient horse does, slow, sure, on familiar ground. In the morning he'll wake to stiffness, yes, but not to the bitterness of a night fought and lost. He'll make miles that would have been misery without this small mercy. The road is long, the weather fickle, the risks real, but tonight the plant watches with him. Then, for him, while he rests, others far away will write its virtues into books, grind it into pastes, lift it in censers, argue its morals, and hide it in graves. Out here, it's simpler. He breathes, he sleeps, he survives. By daylight, the romance of the open land burns off fast. Herding looks graceful from a ridge, but up close, its hooves on frozen ground, knees jolted for hours, tendons lit like harp strings that never slacken. A rider's spine becomes a ledger of every rut and sudden stop. Fingers split in the cold and heal into thicker skin. Then a rope yanks and opens them again. Ankles twist, stepping off into holes you didn't see. Men and women bruise and keep moving. They treat soreness like weather. Annoying, yes, but not a reason to stop the work that keeps everyone fed. Chronic pain isn't a side story in this world. It's the baseline hum. The tasks repeat. A girth strap rubs the same spot on your calf until a deep ache writes itself into your gait. A shoulder that was wrenched a decade ago protests every time you throw a pack. A cracked tooth throbs whenever the wind shifts. There's no clinic to visit after dinner, only what you brought and what you remember. And sleep, the one repair crew you can count on, is constantly under threat. Predators test the perimeter. Wolves probe, then vanish. Thieves follow herds at a distance, judging fatigue. The weather has moods, wind that claws, snow that shrugs off, fire heat like a challenge. Caravan life adds its own cruelty. You don't sleep when your body asks. You sleep when the watch rotation says you can, and only if the road hasn't taken a wheel, only if the next pass isn't icing. Men learn to fall asleep fast and wake faster. Women do too, and they sleep lighter still because children stir and need warmth or water. Remedies exist, but they travel slowly. Animal fat salves hold heat against joints. Fermented mare's milk clears the throat, and if you're not careful, the next day. Bitter herbs steeped in leather cups dull a fever's edge, yet taste like punishment. None are quick. Most require fuel and time, both rationed. That's why the herb that works through breath matters. It needs only a handful of seed and a shard of dried flour, a pocket brazier, a moment's shelter. In a world of weight, it's a light solution. In a world of delay, it's fast. Smoke enters where breath already goes. It works where the pain is processed, loosening the mind's grip on the message that never stops. This hurts, this hurts, this hurts. The body still knows it's cold, knows the rib is bruised, knows the ankle's not right. But the alarm bell stops shrieking and starts chiming, and you can think your way through tying the rope you need tied. You can lie down and not rehearse every mistake you could make tomorrow and every consequence of those mistakes. Sleep finds you not because nothing's wrong, but because something has shifted. The micro-stories pile up across a season. On a raid, a rider catches a spear haft across the chest. He laughs it off at the fire, but 3 nights later the laughter's gone and he can't breathe deep without seeing white. He's not a priest. He's not a fool. He warms stones, sprinkles seed, and lets the breath modulate the pain so he can rest long enough to ride the return. In midwinter, a woman who manages pack animals lies awake 3 nights before a push across an exposed plain. By the 4th night, her hands shake at noon. She burns a little. It doesn't turn fear into courage. It turns vigilance into focus. Travelers learn to ration. The plant is portable, but not infinite. You save the better resin for when the river crossing knocks you into ice and every muscle seizes. You use seed on quieter nights, for the nut oil's gentle weight and the smoke's soft nudge. You share at funerals because grief is a community injury, and easing it together is how you remember the person without breaking apart. You don't use it when you watch alone on the ridge. You need the hawk's eye there, not the softened edge. Guilds and caravans build routines around this economy of sleep. The cook keeps salves near the coals. The older hands remind the young to drink water before they burn anything. There are rules, unwritten but enforced by looks. Not before riding, not when you hold the map, not when storms are stalking the horizon. Relief is a tool, and tools are for tasks, not for drifting. Leaders know why it matters beyond kindness. A rested crew makes fewer costly errors. A lightly eased back lifts more, ties better, sees farther. In harsh lands, competence is mercy. Meanwhile, scarcity shapes choices. The same plant fibers your ropes, patches your tent, wraps wounds, boils into porridge in lean weeks. You measure what becomes smoke against what must become cordage. You trade for higher resin tops, only when the winter looks long and the elders look tired. You count braziers at season's end, the way others count coins, because the stones hold more than heat. They hold the memory of nights you turned a losing hand into a playable one. And still there are nights you abstain. You test your pain without help to know where you stand. You see if sleep will come on its own, because out here, reliance is as dangerous as bravado. The plant's value isn't in escape. It's in the margin it creates between injury and error, between fear and panic, between wakefulness and the kind of exhaustion that ruins judgment. In that narrow margin, people make it through. They rise, soar, but steady, and they make miles. To understand why our rider trusts those glowing stones, we need to step inside a funeral tent described 25 centuries ago. Herodotus wrote it down in a voice half curious, half awed. The mourners took hemp seed, threw it onto red-hot stones inside a sealed tent, and when the place filled with thick vapor, they shouted for joy. Not a lecture, not a doctrine, an observation of bodies in a box of heat and smoke. Grief tilting toward release. For a long time, readers treated that passage like travel writing with a flair for exaggeration. Then the ground gave us its answer. Across the steppe, burial mounds opened and repeated the same scene in fragments you could hold. Archaeologists lifted tent frames collapsed into earth, copper censers blackened by years of use, and fur bags filled with seeds gone stone hard. The kits were practical. A small brazier, a set of stones, a vessel for carrying embers, a pouch for plant matter. Some were plain and worn, some were worked with care. The pattern wasn't an oddity in one grave, but a habit across many, found with men and women, young and old. The way people pack the same indispensable gear for a journey they've all learned to survive. In one kurgan, gold vessels lay face down, as if someone had set them aside mid-ritual and never came back. When specialists scraped the dark film clinging to their interiors and ran tests, two signatures appeared: cannabis and opium residue. Gold, yes, but the more valuable thing was the chemistry. It moved Herodotus from rumor toward record and complicated the picture too. Relief wasn't a single-note solution. It was a palette mixed for effect. Sorrow eased, bodies soothed, and minds prepared to sit where loss was heavy. The story tightened further in mountains east of the steppe. On the Pamir Plateau, at Dzerzhankal Cemetery, wooden braziers were found in elite tombs, their charred bowls carrying traces of unusually high THC. Gas chromatography told the part eyes couldn't. These fires burned psychoactive cannabis, less potent than many modern cultivars, but active, more than fiber smoke, less than fantasy. The altitude mattered. Some think those high ridgelines grew stronger plants, others that mourners carried selected tops from lower valleys. Beads from far-off markets and silk scraps lay with the bones, migrants in the isotope record, people who'd crossed languages and passes and still chosen the same simple interface: flame, scent, breath. Imagine the scene, not as spectacle but as work. A body lies prepared, the tense skin draws close, stones glow, music, perhaps a drum or a steady clap, lifts and falls. The first seed hits heat and cracks. A low aroma rolls through nut and resin. A mourner bends, breathes, and the front of their head seems to tug loose from the vise it's been in. Another joins, then another. The keening shifts. It's not joy in the modern sense. It's the body recognizing a door has opened in a wall it was pushing against. Muscles let go what they can. Tears come easier, not as panic, but as flow. Meanwhile, the kids tell us this wasn't confined to the elite's last day. Many sets are scuffed, repaired, carried, fur bags stitched and restitched, braziers dented, stones heat-shocked and still serviceable. You don't bury brand new tools to symbolize an idea. You bury the ones that did the job. Those jobs weren't identical. Sometimes the smoke wrapped grief. Sometimes it steadied a hand before a bone set. Sometimes it turned a night of pain into a night of sleep. And then there is the Altai burial, the press called a princess. A woman preserved in ice with a container of cannabis near her. Later studies suggested she'd lived with a tumor. You can draw no neat line from diagnosis to intent in a grave, but the proximity of plant to person opens a human-shaped question. Did she use it because it helped? Not a cure, nothing so grand, but a turning down of the body's noise so that days stayed bearable and nights were not all battle. Herodotus gave us the tent and the shout. The earth gave us the hardware, the residues, the geography. Together they sketch a ritual that was also a technology, a therapy that was also a bond. Mourners shared air, shared altered breath, shared the same timed release from nerves locked too tight. Outside, horses snorted frost. Inside, people learned a way to make hurt carryable, long enough to do what came next: wash the body, share meat, ride home, sleep. It matters that the plant wore other clothes too: rope and cloth, seed and oil. In camp, it bound loads and mended tears. In camp, it flavored gruel in lean weeks. That flexibility is part of why smoke time felt legitimate. rather than transgressive. You weren't bringing a stranger into the tent. You were asking another face of the same companion to work. The relief lived inside a whole. Fiber, food, medicine, right. Our rider wasn't copying a book when he sheltered his brazier. He was repeating what graves reveal and a Greek traveler noticed: heat the stones, feed them seed and resin, breathe, and let the pain move from crisis to background. The tents change, the words change, the work doesn't. While Herodotus watched the steppe, another fire glowed higher, where air thins and breath itself becomes labor. The Pamir Plateau lifts you to a place where voices carry and wood is scarce. At Tranquil Cemetery, around 500 BCE, mourners chose altitude as their witness. They set their dead among stone rings and striped slopes and left tools that still hold the story. Simple wooden braziers, charred bowls, small enough to cup, blackened enough to say they worked hard before they were buried. These weren't props. When researchers swabbed the soot and ran the chemistry, the results were plain. The residues carried THC at levels unusual for wild hemp. Not modern potency, but psychoactive, active enough to tilt perception and loosen a body locked by grief or cold. It's one thing to read that in a paper. It's another to imagine someone crouched in thin air, warming a brazier against the wind, feeding it plant, and letting breath take the medicine where it always goes first. The place itself says a lot. 10,000 feet is an odd choice if all you want is privacy. The climb costs energy, fuel, daylight. But high valleys grow different plants, and some speculate that stress and sun coaxed richer resin from the flowers there. Others think people brought selected tops from lower slopes, saving the best for last rites. Either way, the choice speaks intent. These were not accidents of campfire smoke. They were design moments, controlled heat, controlled breath, a room made by cloth or rock to hold the haze long enough for it to work. Tranquil's graves tell of travelers, glass beads from far west markets, silk from far east looms, and bones that grew in one place and died in another. Migrants tracked by isotopes. Call them Sogdian, call them highland traders, call them a braid of people who knew roads and bargains and how to stitch up or ceremony from pieces. They lived where the Silk Road was still a cluster of paths, and the brazier's bowls still carry their decision. This plant belongs at the threshold between world and memory. Picture the sequence the residue implies. Flames lick low, a seed crackles, a curl of nut scent signals the start. Then the stronger stuff, crushed tops sprinkled to smoke that's sweet and a little bitter, carrying the compounds that loosen the jaw and slow the drum in the chest. There's rhythm, the human kind. Clapping, a drum, a chant that keeps breath in time so nobody rushes and coughs the help away. In thin air, timing matters. In thin air, you share heat and smoke and the responsibility to keep the small fire alive. The wooden braziers were clustered in elite tombs, which suggests access, status, or both. Not everyone was buried with a personal kit, but residue doesn't respect class boundaries. It tells only what burned, not who paid. What else lies around speaks to a shared practice adapted to hierarchy. The dead wore their best, the living used their best, and for the length of the rite, breath made a commons in a cold place. It's tempting to romanticize, but the details stay sober. The bowls are plain. The char is patchy, like any bowl that's done many small jobs rather than a few grand ones. The wood is local, shaped quick. There's no excess ornament, only function. Surface to hold hot stones or coals, a lip to keep plant from blowing away. a form easy to carry up a slope with cold fingers. What did it do there besides modest euphoria? It likely narrowed pain to a size people could sit beside. It likely softened fear without erasing it, which is important on mountain paths where fear keeps you alive. It likely made hunger less urgent while rites took their time. And then, after, when the brazier's glow sank under ash, it likely gave the living one more gift. A night of sleep in a tent where grief would otherwise have kept eyes wide and minds galloping. Meanwhile, down on the plains and far east in walled towns, people wrote the plant's virtues into lists and argued about its place. Up here, practice answered before theory. Does this help us do what we must? The answer at Jazankhul was yes, often enough to make the climb and keep the bowls and bury them when they'd done their share. Our rider on the step would recognize the method, if not the view. Heat stones, feed, seed, and top. Shelter the ember from wind, breathe measured. Let relief show in the shoulders, not the mouth. Then do the work, wrap the body, sing the last song, tie the last knot, and later lie down and let the plant watch the first part of the night so sleep can watch the rest. While high-altitude fires burned in the Pamirs, a quieter world arranged the same plant into principles, recipes, and rules. In early China, people called it ma, hemp when you spun it, medicine when you brewed it, incense when you warmed it on a brazier. The word didn't split the plant into moral categories. It sorted uses: fiber, seed, flower, each with its own work. The oldest stories give it a place inside a universe of balance. Fuxi, the culture hero who framed yin and yang like two hands fitting, appears in later memory noting Ma as a medicine that could harmonize opposing forces. Not chemistry, not yet, pattern. If a body ran too hot, you calmed it. If it ran too cold, you stirred it. Ma was listed among tools that helped the system find its middle. Then came Shenong, the divine farmer, the name on the first pharmacopoeia people kept copying and refining. The classic attributed to him, compiled much later but carrying older knowledge, files cannabis among useful herbs with both grounding and mind-lightening potential. Remedies read like kitchen practice turned clinical. Seeds for the gut and rest. Inflorescences for pain and spasm. Preparations to ease malaria's bone-deep chills, gout's angry joints, menstrual cramping, and an over-busy mind. One line many remember notes that in certain quantities, taken long, one becomes light. A poetic flag that the plant could tilt perception as well as settle the body. China's genius was not only cataloging but distinguishing parts. Seeds, tiny, oily achenes, were everyday medicine. You toasted them lightly, ground them, mixed them into porridge or brewed them into gentle teas that eased constipation, soothed dryness, and, by their slow weight, nudged sleep. Leaves and flowers, the mafen, were more guarded, used when pain spoke too loudly, or when a surgeon needed cooperation from a patient who would otherwise flinch. Daily life made the plant ordinary long before doctors made it technical. Hemp cloth kept bodies clothed, paper kept records dry, rope made nets that fed villages. A household could be wrapped in emar without touching its resin. That ubiquity mattered. When a healer reached for the same plant's tops or seeds, it didn't feel like calling on an exotic force. It felt like asking a familiar neighbor to do a different job. One detail in the medical tradition stands out. Control. Text described dose, context, and combination. You didn't simply burn and breathe because you hurt. You matched preparation to condition. Seeds went with honey or warm water for dryness, a stronger decoction or a small amount of smoked inflorescence for cramps that made breath short. Practitioners watched for signs, pulse qualities, tongue color, that told them whether a patient needed warming, cooling, relaxing, or anchoring. Ma could serve several of these aims if you chose the part and the method carefully. The surgical law of Huatuo sits like a brazier in the middle of this record. He lived during the later Han, a physician remembered for clean incisions and calm patients. Accounts say he used MR blended with wine, mafesan, to dull pain before procedures, a preparation that reads like the first attempt at anesthesia in East Asia. Archaeology adds a small flame to the legend. In a tomb attributed to his era, a simple brazier and images of people at leisure with smoke suggest the inhaled route was known alongside the cup. Whether he himself burned it in practice, the point holds. Cannabis wasn't only for quiet evenings. It entered the clinic with intent. Meanwhile, scribes kept hemp under their brush hands. Paper made from its fibers carried the very formulas that mentioned the plant. That circularity, writing ma on ma, says something about integration. The tool and the record of the tool coexisted. Farmers sowed for cloth and oil. Apothecaries stocked jars for bowels and joints. Priests sometimes placed the plant in incense to frame a ritual. Physicians made choices within a framework that prized moderation and fit. Debate existed, of course. Confucian-minded officials worried about anything that loosened attention, while Taoist experimenters were more willing to test altered states for insight. The medical mainstream sat between. Respect the plant, measure it, avoid excess. Classical texts rarely celebrate intoxication. They note it as a side effect to watch, a reason to adjust dose, or chose seeds instead of tops. In Holmes, the seed's continuity is the quiet thread. For nearly 2 millennia, it remains the safest, most used part in Chinese practice. A moistening, settling food medicine that travels well and keeps. Mothers add a spoon to congee when a child can't sleep after fever. Elders take a warm seed brew for dry bowels in winter. In harder cases, a physician decides when flour belongs, often in mixtures that include ginger, peony, or licorice to steer the effect. Our rider on the step would recognize the logic if not the vocabulary. He used breath and ember. They used cup, brazier, and scale. He watched his body's signals. They read pulse and complexion. Both aimed at the same outcome. Pain dialed down enough to work, sleep steady enough to repair. In China's hands, Ma stopped being only a survival trick. It became a taught craft, part philosophy, part household skill, part surgery, rooted not in myth alone, but in recipes you could pass to an apprentice and expect the same result tomorrow. South of the high passes, the plant gained a new register, sacred without losing its use. In the Atharva Veda, a hymn names it among the 5 holy plants, a gift that lifts sorrow. Later stories braid it to Shiva, the ascetic who knows both drought and inner storms. In that telling, the herb tempers heat, softens austerity's bite, and turns sleepless vigil into wakeful ease. Divinity here doesn't cancel the body, it attends to it. The form most people met wasn't a brazier's breath, but a cup. Bang! Leaves and tender tops pounded with stone, folded into milk with spices, traveled as a drink that could be portioned and shared. Cardamom and pepper shaped the flavor. Sugar eased the bitterness. Ghee carried it smooth. The preparation mattered. It slowed onset, rounded the sharper edges, and suited long nights of song or long afternoons of work. that couldn't afford clumsy hands. Where smoke rushed, Bang paced itself. Festival rhythm explains part of its endurance. On nights like Maha Shivaratri, families kept lamps burning and mouths singing until dawn. Fasting emptied the belly. Devotion emptied the mind's usual chatter almost. Bodies still ached on stone floors. Eyes still stung. A ladle of Bang didn't erase discipline. It supported it. Knees tolerated hours cross-legged. Back softened their protests. Grief brought to a shrine could be carried home without breaking the day after. When the sun rose, people slept. Villages kept the practice plain. A pot appeared at weddings and funerals alike, not as transgression, but as hospitality for joints and nerves. Farmers finishing threshing season stirred it into a copper cup and passed it, laughing quieter than the cup's reputation suggests. Women with menstrual cramping drank a thinner mix before lying down for a mid-afternoon rest they'd otherwise skip. Old men with night coughs thickened theirs with more milk and less leaf, timing the dose to meet the hour when lungs woke them. Holy men used it differently. Yogis who held postures until calves shook sipped to soften the body's argument without losing attention. Renunciants who walked barefoot through heat drank to turn hunger's sharpness into a bearable background while they kept a mantra. The line between worship and care blurred on purpose. Relief made devotion sustainable. Devotion made relief acceptable. The same duality appears in temple kitchens. Priests treated Bang as prasad, offered and then consumed, turning a plant into a link between deity and devotee, and also, quietly, between sleepless nights and the steadiness needed to greet crowds the next morning. In smaller shrines, the herb burned in censers, not to intoxicate a hall, but to warm the air with a faint grounding scent during long recitations. You could say it sanctified rest. Not everyone approved every use. Householders tolerated festival cups and frowned at idlers who let afternoons leak away under a tree. Elders warned boys against a daily habit that dulled initiative. Village councils set informal norms. No bang before the irrigation gates opened. None for the watchman. The plant's presence in myth didn't exempt it from community rules. If anything, the stories raised the bar. Divine association demanded respectful conduct. Medical writers recorded the same practical tone. Texts in the Ayurvedic stream listed preparations for digestion, fever, and pain, with cautions about heaviness and dryness if overused. They advise combining leaf with warming spices to counter cooling effects, and milk to buffer the gut. For sleep, small doses. For spasm, a touch more. For melancholy, only in company, with conversation or chant. Less solitary brooding turned deeper. The herb was a tool, and tools gained or lost value by how they were held. Micro-stories trace the human contour. A widow after a cremation sits in the courtyard as neighbors ladle bang in a brass cup. The first swallow loosens the knot just enough that tears fall without choking her. She sleeps under a cousin's shawl and wakes with the strength to return the borrowed plates. A carter whose wrists burn after days on the road drinks a half cup at dusk. He rubs sesame oil into his hands and sleeps without waking to the phantom jolt of potholes. A pilgrim on a riverbank takes a sip, watches lamps drift, and for once doesn't rehearse debts. Threads from the Steprider's Kid are here too translated. Portability remains. Dried leaf in a pouch, a stone mortar, spices from the same stall where you bought grain. Rationing remains. Festival first, work second, early night before early start. Community remains. Shared bowls, shared rules, shared memory of who handles it well, and who needs a friendly nudge to hold back? In this landscape, the plant's voice changes timbre, but not message. It says, the body hurts, the mind stirs. There is a middle path between indulgence and austerity. It offers a steadying cup and asks for steadiness in return. And when the conch sounds at dawn, those who drank in measure rise and carry their share, rested enough to call the day holy and mean it. Down the Nile, relief learned the language of ointment and incense. In papyri kept carefully in temple houses, healers listed remedies in neat lines, poultices for swelling, infusions for fever, oils for aching joints. Among them sits a plant whose seed and resin traveled well. The Ebers papyrus, older than most kingdoms, notes preparations for inflammation and pain, for the eyes when light feels like knives, for a temper that storms too easily. Nothing sensational, just entries in a long ledger of what works. Egypt preferred hands and vessels to braziers and tents. Priests ground herbs on flat stones, added oils pressed from seeds, and warm mixtures over coals until scents rose soft and steady. The temple air was thick with frankincense and myrrh, and sometimes, folded into the blend, a note from hemp, faintly green, slightly nutty, a grounding weight beneath the sweet. Relief arrived through skin, not only through breath. The gatekeepers of this mercy wore linen and knew their measures. In medical houses attached to shrines, they acted as pharmacists and clinicians both. People came with throbbing foreheads, joints swollen from labor, eyes inflamed by wind and sand. A salve warmed in a clay bowl and stroked along the temples could take the edge off a royal migraine, and a farm wife's stubborn ache in equal measure. No one waited for miracles. They asked for what would allow them to get back to carrying water, carving stone, counting shipments, chanting prayers. Midwives used the plant with a steady realism that outlasts fashion. Childbirth in rooms cooled by fans and fanned by neighbors needed any kindness available. A thin oil, rubbed low across the belly and into the small of the back, didn't stop contractions. It softened their bite and gave breath a chance to stay even. Afterward, when sleeplessness stalked the mother with every small sound, a bit more oil and a warm cloth helped her drop into the first unbroken hour. Mercy measured. In hours is still mercy. The court had its own aches. A pharaoh's crown made of gold is a story. The weight of rule lands between the eyes. Palace records and gossip alike remember headaches, soothed by quiet hands in darkened rooms. A scribe dimmed lamps. A servant warmed the blend. A priest murmured a hymn. That also paced the massage. Eyes closed, shoulders slackened, and the day's audience line shortened a little when sleep finally came. There's nothing grand in this. That's what makes it true. Incense was medicine too. In temples, resin burned in censers that swung on chains, smoke carrying prayers toward carved ceilings. Fold a bit of cannabis into that mix and you don't intoxicate a hall. You lower the pitch of the room. People breathe deeper without noticing why. Sound softens, time lengthens, just enough for him and the heartbeat to meet. In the corner, a woman who's carried grief for months feels her jaw unclench for the first time in weeks, and for the length of a psalm, she isn't braced for the next blow. What the living practiced, the dead carried. Wrappings bear traces, not because the dead needed to be calmed, but because the plant had become part of care itself. Ointments went with bodies into their longhouse as if to say, "May comfort travel with you." Jars sealed with wax kept recipes meant for both worlds. You can call it superstition. You can also hear the human impulse to send what helped most across the threshold. The plant sat beside others Egypt trusted. Flax wove linens, poppy bled its own sleep, willow bark cooled heat. Hemp's fiber helped bind boats, nets, and bindings. Its seed gave oil to lamps and bowls. Its resin joined the apothecary's vocabulary. The culture valued what could serve many roles. That pragmatism made space for quiet mercy without needing to argue about it. Micro-stories hold the scent. A stonecutter returns home with wrists screaming, streaks dust from his arms, and sits while his wife warms a small jar near the coals. She rubs the oil from thumb to forearm until his fingers stop clenching. He eats, then sleeps. A novice scribe blinks at the glare on his tablet, eyes burning. The temple healer dabs a diluted preparation on his lid's edges and tells him to sit in shade. The sting eases. The headache that would have stolen the night recedes. A mother who lost a child months ago sits at the back of a ritual, head bowed. The incense smoke finds her, and for a few breaths she doesn't rehearse that day. And later, at home, for once, she sleeps before midnight. Egypt's ethos wasn't to chase ecstasy. It was to keep the machinery of a vast society moving with the least suffering possible. A small mercy applied at the right time was worth as much as a bold cure in a land where work never stopped. So the plant took its place on shelves, beside jars labeled for fever, for swelling, for nights when the mind won't quiet. No speeches were needed. The recipes were enough. While the Nile worked with oils and china-measured cups, lands between rivers and mountains turned smoke into a question, and sometimes an answer. In Assyrian tablets, a word appears, konubu, close enough to our modern name to feel like a hand on the shoulder. Priests fed resin to coals in temples where carved wings shadowed the floor. The smoke wasn't a party. It was a tool to sharpen prayer, to steady attention, so a line of chant held firm without fraying. In Persia proper, the plant stepped into a house already lit by fire. Zoroastrian worship set flame at the center, clean, bright, a point to look at when the mind wanted to wander. Add a pinch of resin to the brazier, and the room's tempo shifted a notch slower. Doubt quieted. A verse repeated itself with less effort. The idea wasn't to flee the world. It was to face it without the constant buzz of nerves. Priests spoke of removing uncertainty the way you clear grit from a lens. Merchants carried the habit along with folded cloth and stamped metal. Resin traveled better than leaf, a dark, portable version of what stepriders burned green. In caravanserais, small bowls appeared at twilight. The smoke kept close, the talk disciplined. Rates, routes, weather, and, underneath, a low hum of thought about meaning that tended to surface when bodies finally sat still. Wisdom in a brazier, people called it without irony, because a little ease let words land without tearing. Not everyone approved. As in every culture that found the plant's mercy, suspicion grew in public even as private rooms kept their small fires. Court moralists turned their brows into warnings. Officials wrote edicts that praised restraint and occasionally punished excess. The pattern was familiar. Rope and seed were uncontroversial. Resin made reputations nervous. In markets, people balanced what they sold with how they behaved. The way a man might pour wine for a guest, but never walk the street with a cup. Then there were the thinkers, as common here as traders. A courtyard, a clay lamp, a few scholars with feet tucked under them, and a brazier low enough not to distract. A question proposed. When does pain exhaust courage, and when can a measured easing preserve it? They talked through examples, soldiers before a march, a judge after a long day. an old man whose legs aren't his anymore. The smoke didn't settle the debate. It made space to hold it without irritation edging every sentence. Stories traveled too, some helpful, some not. One persistent tale tried to tie intoxication to fanatic courage, as if devotion grew in smoke. But the better records point elsewhere. Serious, sects kept discipline. Their awe was trained, not purchased. Centuries later, enemies would twist a word for resin into a word for killers. But in these earlier rooms, the herb was a modest assistant, not a spell. Meanwhile, the plant did its quieter work in homes. A mother rubbed a little resin in the warm oil and circled her husband's knee until the grinding softened. A night watchman's wife warned him, "None until dawn. You need your sharpness now." He agreed and saved a pinch for after, when sleep would come hard under bright morning. The distinction mattered. Smoke for rest, not for watch. Language shifted the plant's name as it crossed tongues. Kunubu in one mouth, Kunabu in another, Kanab in traders' slang. Each word carried a slightly different shade of meaning, but the object stayed plain. A small help when the mind's rope was pulled too tight. Zoroastrian prayer halls, with their fire kept clean and protected, tolerated the scent because it didn't defile flame, it framed it. In cities thick with thought, physicians took notes. Al-Razi and later Ibn Sina would write of preparations that soothed pain and settled digestion, with cautions about dryness, slowness, and excess. They weren't shouting. They were reminding readers that tools need stewardship. Dose mattered. Timing mattered. Company mattered. Smoke in a circle of steady people tended toward steadiness. Alone, brooding could deepen. The Silk Road gave the plant more than customers. It gave it context. In one town, smoke marked morning. In another, it accompanied long readings. In a third, it stayed in kitchens as an oil to rub and never to burn. A caravan moved and customs braided. A Sogdian host lit a brazier and a Persian guest declined until after their ledger closed. Respect was part of the ritual. Our rider would understand the leisure hour, the shared bowl after risk has passed. A philosopher in Ctesiphon would understand the rider's rule, none on the ridge. Between them stood a plant that proved flexible enough to serve conscience and bone, prayer and sleep, without demanding a temple of its own. It didn't make saints or fools by itself. It made room, and in that room, people set their intentions, argued their ethics, and after the words died down, finally slept. While priests in Persia weighed smoke against conscience, the Greek world turned the same plant into notes in a physician's margin and cord in a fisherman's hand. In gardens outside the city walls, doctors tested salves on swollen knees and poultices behind aching ears. Writers like Dioscorides later filed cannabis among remedies for inflammation and ear pain, for inner ache that felt like a fist folded inside the body. They weren't romantic about it. They boiled seeds, crushed green parts, and mixed them with wine or oil, then watched whether sleep came and whether morning felt less sharp. At the same time, the hemp stalks thickened in fields and became rope that didn't rot when salted by sea. A boatman trusted a line that held even after weeks in spray. Sailors tied nets with hemp cord, then hauled them at dawn with palms already stung. The plant lived two lives at once, medicine on a shelf, fiber on a dock. The double presence shaped attitude. Relief didn't feel foreign when it came from something the harbor relied on. Greeks argued as they did about everything. Symposiums, with wine flowing and tongues loosened, sometimes touched the plant's sharper face, resin that burned or mixed could lift mood and loosen grief. There were cautions too. Philosophers prized clarity. Anything that blurred edges drew suspicion. So the herb's place settled near the clinic and the workshop, not the stage. If someone burned it, it tended to be in small rooms, after hard days, not in public halls. They also watched the step from a distance. Herodotus's Scythian tent scene circulated as a curiosity, admiration at vigor, unease at the howl. The Greek instinct was to observe and keep 2 steps back. Relief was acceptable, spectacle wasn't. A widower might accept a physician's oil for his pounding head. He wouldn't invite his friends to a tent of smoke. Restraint dressed itself as virtue, but it was also a way to keep civic life predictable. When the world rolled west into Rome, the plant came along in bales and jars, and the balance tilted further toward work. Rome loved what could be measured. Hemp became sails that pushed triremes across the Tyrrhenian, ropes that hoisted standards, cords that stitched tents for miles of marching. The empire was a machine, and hemp was part of its moving parts. In that role, it became unquestioned. You can despise a plant in a poem and still bless it when it holds a mast in a gale. Physicians working in Latin borrowed the Greek books and added their own notes. Earaches were common in a city of baths and draughts. An infusion of seed in warm oil calmed them. Joints inflamed by marching and load-bearing received rubs that blended the plant with fat to carry it into skin. Writers recommended it for gout, for quelling too eager bodies, for lulling a mind that refused to sleep after campaigns. The tone stayed practical. Dose small, watch dryness, adjust. Women's rooms kept another register. Oils labeled for female complaints lived in chests beside combs. Midwives learned what helped cramps and what didn't, what made the night after birth bearable and what made it too heavy. Quiet expertise passed hand to hand, not shouted from the forum. Respectability ran on that kind of care, unseen but constant. Public morals split the plan again. Wine had a sanctioned place. Intoxication by other means felt suspect, foreign. So people used what worked and spoke about it less. A captain might lie on a board and let a surgeon warm oil into a shoulder he couldn't lift. He wouldn't praise resin in the Senate. Rome preferred its relief discreet. The law tolerated rope and seed without question, frowned at the rest, and mostly looked away when the households reached for what soothed. The plant spread with legions, whether anyone debated it or not. Soldiers carried seed to new soils. Farmers tried it and kept what grew. In Britain's damp, hemp became cordage that didn't fail. In Africa's ports, it joined nets already cast. Quiet empire, people called it later, the empire of fiber. Beneath that, a smaller empire of relief moved too, entering kitchens, clinics, and baths with the same lack of ceremony. Microstories sketch the Roman way. A centurion with a knee that swelled after a day's march sat while a medicus kneaded warmed oil into the joint until the ache dulled to bearable, and sleep came. A laundress with shoulders on fire from lifting wet cloth accepted a neighbor's jar and found that, for once, she didn't wake at every crow's call. A clerk, whose mind rattled after a tribunal, took a measured draught, then slept through the city's usual clatter. Restraint wasn't hypocrisy so much as policy. Use the tool, avoid the theater. The plant obliged. It didn't ask for temples. It asked for a brazier, a cup, a cloth, a rope. In Greece and Rome alike, it became what societies needed most from it: strength in fiber, steadiness in nerve, a night of sleep after a day that left the body begging. The debate kept its formal voice. The hands kept working, and in the margin between rule and practice, relief kept its place. While Rome tied sails with hemp and physicians counted drops, the road that stitched continents together moved the plant in quieter ways. The Silk Road wasn't a single ribbon, but a web of tracks, caravanserais, and mountain passes where evening gathered traders into circles of breath and bargaining. In those circles, relief traveled as a small dark cake, hashish, pressed for the journey, resistant to weather, easy to portion by thumbnail. Resin had become luggage. Merchants thought in weights and risks. Spices perfumed a ledger. Silk shouted value. Hashish hid in plain cloth bundles, declared as medicine for travel. It was, and everyone knew it. The plant's pressed form behaved better than loose leaf in dry air and thin tents. A sliver on a coal or crumbled into a cup did what it always had. Lowered the day's hiss to a hum, eased knotted calves and made cold ground more forgiving. When it was finally time to lie down, caravan life enforced clocks nobody chose. Dawn loading, noon heat, dusk relief, night watch. At way stations, stone-walled inns gave shelter from wind and thieves. In their courtyards, men from Sogdiana, Bactria, Khotan, and beyond sat side by side, each with their own word for the same thing, each with a ritual that rhymed. One host warmed a small brazier and snapped a cake, the edges glossy, the scent earthy sweet. Cups moved, some with tea, some with milk, some with nothing at all but breath. Conversation followed a pattern too. Rates, road reports, a joke, then a story about a teacher or an ancestor who swore the same herb had steadied him before a long decision. These stops became social clinics. A camel driver's back seized after a day on salt flats. Someone passed a pinch. Someone else needed his spine. A scribe's eyes burned from tallying bolts of cloth. A puff softened his brow, and he slept before the courtyard drum closed the gate. A woman, leading pack goats for her father, rubbed resin and oil into her knees and shared a small roll with a friend whose mind wouldn't quiet after a rock slide. The road's rules were strict. Within them, care was communal. Hashish changed the plant's logistics, but not its ethic. Resin was simply the form that survived the Taklamakan's dryness, the Pamir's heights, the Levant's shifting checkpoints. It also traveled in story. The word itself shifted, picked up accents, lost consonants, reappeared in poems and warnings. A legend bloomed later that tried to weld resin to fanatic blades. The evidence says trade and talk did most of the moving. Dens existed, rooms where people met the plant after work, not as fugitives from it. In some towns, they were called by names softer than vice and closer to rest. Physicians along the routes wrote as physicians do, use for pain, for melancholy, for the belly when travel upends it. They argued doses in margins, cautioned about dryness of mouth, dullness if daily. In cities like Ray, Nishapur, and Baghdad, scholars folded the plant into questions already on the table. What eases without enslaving? What helps a mind attend when it must? What belongs in public and what at home? Markets were less philosophical. They cared that the small cake was cheaper to ship than jarred oil and more dependable on a long run. In caravanserais, etiquette grew like ivy. You didn't light before animals were watered. You didn't press a second share on someone who had watch. You didn't talk price once the coal was lit. The night's heat was for recovery, not leverage. The best host kept 2 braziers, one near the cooks, one in a quiet corner for those who needed silence more than laughter. Fireside songs slowed, then softened further as breath matched rhythm. In the morning, the same people moved quickly, eyes clearer for having slept, The road braided cultures. A Sogdian merchant learned a Kashmiri way to crumble resin into milk with pistachio and sugar, saved it for winter mornings when frost clung to the tent ropes. A Chinese envoy acquired a taste for a spiced drink that owed something to bang and something to local almonds, kept the habit on return, careful to drink it only at dusk. A Turkic herder picked up the habit of pinching smoke after funerals and carried it back to his flatter lands. None of these adoptions were wholesale. Each community filtered practice through old rules. Not before a ride. Not alone, if sorrow is sharp. Not at all, if fear needs to stay loud. Myths move too. A whisper about killers born of resin drifted west with mistranslations. In the courtyards, people rolled their eyes. The men who lifted bales and threaded passes knew the truth. Courage on a cliff comes from clear feet, not softened knees. The plant's place stayed the evening. The wound, the watch, already ended. The road also amplified the plant's other lives. Hemp cord was traded along with the resin, coils stacked beside dates and wool. Sailcloth woven from distant fields arrived to meet ships upriver. Seeds labeled for lamp oil shared space with pepper sacks. A single species kept 3 jobs on a ledger: fiber, food, relief, and that versatility protected it. Authorities taxed what they could count, scolded what made noise, tolerated what made their own backs sleep better after a journey. As caravans moved, a thought repeated itself under low stars. Relief is a passport when nights are long. Shared breath, shared bowls, shared rules kept people from fraying on roads that ate the careless. The plant didn't erase danger. It helped people meet it, rest afterward, and get up before dawn when the guard's knock sounded on the courtyard door. While the caravans traded cakes and cords, cities of learning took up the same plant and placed it on a scale alongside law and longing. The Quran forbade wine, clear and explicit. About this herb, it said little. Silence opened a narrow door, and in that doorway jurists, physicians, and mystics stood together, each with a different lantern. Scholars began with first principles, harm and benefit. If a thing dulled the mind to negligence, it belonged with vice. If it eased pain, steadied a stomach, or calmed a heart without pulling a person past their duties, it might be tolerated. In legal commentaries you see the careful phrasing: avoid intoxication, permit medicine. Grey, not black. Physicians wrote more plainly. Al-Razi listed preparations that soothed aches and helped digestion, with notes about dryness and dose. Ibn Sina wrote of its cooling qualities, its use for pain, melancholy, and sleeplessness, always with the physician's refrain: small amounts, proper timing, combine with moistening agents, watch the tongue and pulse. They treated it like any potent remedy, useful in measure, harmful in excess. In markets, this guidance translated into jars and rules. Apothecaries kept resin and seed behind the counter with opopanax and asafoetida. A customer asked for help sleeping after fever. The vendor measured a crumb and told him to take it with sweet syrup at dusk, not after the call to dawn prayer. A woman with a clenched jaw from grief received a softer oil and a quiet warning: share the cup with a friend. Keep the night short, keep the morning. Meanwhile, Sufi lodges turned the conversation toward devotion. In zikr circles, where breath and remembrance braided together, some orders kept the room bare. No smoke, only rhythm. Others, in small gatherings, warmed a pinch over coals to soften the body's noise, so the divine name could be repeated without the sting of knee, back, and doubt. They did not praise delirium. They spoke of hush, of moving beneath the chatter to a steadier place. Resin became a bridge, not the goal, and a bridge you didn't linger on. Poets found language for that bridge. A verse might call it the green friend who lightens the caravan of thought, or the cup without grapes that lets the heart sit down. It wasn't about escape. It was about returning to duties with the sting taken down a notch. Market guards noticed this too. A man who used the herb for leisure and forgot his station drew censure. A saint who used it to pray and woke early to sweep the courtyard often met indulgence. Hashish dens grew in some quarters, rooms where labourers rested their bones and ate hot stew, where scholars argued softly about grammar, where a lute ran scales against the noise of a long day. Authorities alternated between tolerance and crackdown. A governor closed the doors after a brawl. His successor reopened them under rules. No smoke before noon prayers, none for the watch, none near schools. The plant was treated like fire, good in a brazier, dangerous in thatch. The grey zone sharpened around public morality. Preachers warned from pulpits about idleness fed by smoke. Fatwas drew lines, no intoxication, no sale to minors, no public flaunting. Medicine allowed under a physician's supervision. People adjusted. A craftsman stopped by the apothecary at sunset, not noon. A student saved his coin for paper, not resin, until exams ended. A widow kept a tiny jar of oil for nights when worry trampled sleep and never spoke of it in the women's courtyard. In hospitals, Bimaristans, physicians cared less about debate than outcomes. A man with stone pains sweating through linen received a draft that included cannabis among other herbs. He slept. A woman with tremors after childbirth took a syrup that steadied her hands. The staff noted pulse, breath, morning mood. If the patient rose clearer, the remedy was judged sound. If he rose heavy-eyed and dull, the dose was cut or the jar set aside. Travel kept shaping practice. In Cairo, resin crumbled into molasses in a confectioner's stall. In Isfahan, it melted into warm milk. In Nishapur, it burned sparingly at wake's end. Sufi travelers carried etiquette between lodges. No smoke on an empty stomach, none before a journey. None when sadness is acute and solitude tempting. Always with remembrance, always with restraint. Language kept pace. Treatises distinguished sorrow, joy, from sukkar, intoxication. One was a side effect of relief, the other a state that cancelled obligations. The plant was allowed near the former and kept away from the latter. That distinction let conscience breathe. People who needed help could accept it without believing they had abandoned the path. A micro-story from Baghdad lingers, a calligrapher, hands cramped, eyes burning, visits a physician known for gentleness. He receives a small ball of resin mixed with honey, told to take it after evening prayer and to close his ink at once. He does. His fingers uncoil. He sleeps. At dawn, he rises before the muezzin and writes the opening line of a commission without a tremor. He returns to the physician with dates in thanks, and the dose remains a secret between them and God. The legal grey held because people held it. Mystics used the bridge and returned. Physicians measured and recorded. Merchants sold and warned. Judges punished spectacle and protected medicine. Between rule and mercy, the plant found a place where bodies could rest and minds could remember, then stand when the day called. Across the fields of Christendom, hemp stood tall and uncontroversial. Monasteries planted neat rows beside orchards and fish ponds, a practical crop in practical hands. Monks retted stalks in ponds, broke fiber on wooden brakes, and spun thread that became parchment cords, candle wicks, and ropes for bells that marked the hours. The Abbey's ledger praised yields, not moods. In storerooms, skeins hung beside sacks of grain. Hemp kept the place working. Cords for buckets, twine for gardens, cloth for shirts that outlasted several winters. If holiness had a texture, it was often rough, durable, and faintly herbal. Yet in the same walls where rope was a virtue, the herb's gentler face learned to whisper. Apothecaries, some licensed, many tolerated, kept jars labelled for aches and fevers, oils infused with seeds and green parts, tinctures dosed by drops. The church's sermons grew wary of anything that softened minds without sacrament. Ale had a place at table, wine had a place at altar. A smoke with no blessing raised eyebrows. So the plant folded itself into ointments, poultices, and teas that passed as medicine, which they were. The shadows weren't disreputable, they were discreet. Monastic infirmaries practiced a kind of mercy that needed no applause. A lay brother with chilblains sat by the brazier while the infirmera warmed a salve. Animal fat carrying hemp and rosemary, and rubbed it into cracked knuckles until pain subsided enough for sleep. A scribe with a pounding head from hours bent over, vellum rested in a cooled cell. Eyelids dabbed with a seeded infusion, bitterness masked with honey. No one called it intoxication. They called it care. Bells still rang at matins. The scribe, for once, didn't shudder at the sound. Outside the cloister, market town smelled of wet wool, fish, and hemp rope newly tarred. Ships at quays bristled with lines. Sailcloth whispered the plant's deeper empire. Storm-stiffened canvas that let trade ignore distances. Every bale of cloth and barrel of salt moved under hemp's quiet strength. Sailors slept under the same fabric, bodies knotted with labor. In taverns, they rubbed a joint with oil sold by a woman who learned recipes from a mother and a midwife, recipes that ease swelling and coax sleep in loud rooms. No one asked what herb turned the oil green. The question was whether it worked before dawn. Guilds enforced rules that echoed older roads. No dosing before the loom or the forge. None for the night watch. Measure for the sick. Thrift for the well. A weaver's oath valued steady hands. An apprentice who dulled himself earned a cuff and a week of sweeping. But when a master's shoulders burned after a double order, the guild wife warmed a jar and worked balm into muscle until his breath deepened. Pragmatism held court where theology glanced away. Stories rode back with crusaders, dark rooms in foreign cities where men reclined and clouds thickened, rumors that paired resin with sin and daggers. The church folded those tales into homilies about idleness. Parish priests warned against dens of sloth. Yet the same villages trusted midwives who kept small jars for cramps and sleepless fevers, and lay healers who used hemp seed to quiet a belly. Suspicion lived in public. Relief lived in kitchens. Micro-stories crisscrossed the map. A Breton fisherman staggered home after a week at sea, wrists throbbing from lines. His wife warmed an oil and rubbed until his fingers unclenched, and the gull's cries faded from his skull. In Flanders, a fuller with a wet cough tossed at night. A neighbor brewed a seeded tisane and sat with him until his breath stopped digging at his ribs. In the Alps, a muleteer descended with a twisted knee. An innkeeper spread a green salve under linen and said, "Sleep now. There's ice on the pass at dawn." Apothecaries wrote recipes in cramped hand behind shutters. A typical note: seed gently roasted, ground fine, infused in warm wine. A thimble at dusk for the elderly anxious. Another, fat rendered, mixed with herbs including cannabis, applied to joints inflamed by cold. They added cautions: dryness of mouth, heaviness if too much, no use during fast hours unless ordered. The language of caution: let the jars stay on shelves. City councils tolerated what reduced brawls by helping tired men sleep. Authorities drew a line where laughter got too loud. A bailiff fined a host whose back room turned riotous after smoke. The host closed the shutter, kept the oil, and reminded regulars to keep the volume down. A bishop thundered against unnatural pleasures and then accepted hemp rope from local guilds for cathedral work. The contradiction wasn't hypocrisy to those involved, it was triage. Hemp's utility cloaked its mercy. Mercy cloaked its danger. On feast days, songs rose under hempen banners. At night, villagers lay under hempen cloth. In between, some placed a dab of salve on a temple or a spoon of seed tea on the tongue, and finally slept. The herb remained an herb, a thing with roots in fields, with fibers in sails, with a small place in the cupboard for nights that would not yield. It didn't ask for proclamation. It survived on usefulness and on the human habit of separating what helps from what threatens, even when both grow on the same stalk. By now, the plant isn't a mystery so much as a kit with parts. People didn't meet it as a single thing. They met it as three: seed, fiber, flower, each with a job, each with timing, each with rules. That's how our writer understands it in practice. He keeps a pouch of seed, a coil of hemp rope, and a smaller pouch stitched tight for nights when pain won't back down. Seeds come first because they travel best. Hard, oily achenes that don't spoil fast. Light enough to carry by the handful. You can toast them for a nutty bite when rations thin. You can grind them into gruel that sits warm in the belly and quiets a jittery night. Healers everywhere leaned on the seed for gentle medicine, a digestible oil for dry winters, a laxative that doesn't rack the gut, a softener for the edges that keep children awake after fever. In China, seed slips into congee. In Europe, it's steeped as a tisane. In desert towns, it blends with date paste. The seed's promise isn't drama, it's continuity, the slow, moist weight that nudges systems back toward rest. Fiber is the arm and back of the plant, the reason whole economies nodded when hemp sprouted green. Strip the stalk, soak, break, comb, and you have a line that doesn't rot in wet, a cloth that doesn't surrender to hard use, a sail that drinks wind and returns miles. Farmers measure seasons by when the stalks stand tall. Shipyards measure safety by the rope's feel in the hand. In monasteries, bells ring because hemp cords don't snap in damp towers. On the step, saddles hold because hemp thread doesn't cut under strain. Fiber's mercy is indirect but real. It prevents the kind of disaster that makes nights sleepless. A broken line in a storm, a torn harness on a ridge, a ripped tent when the weather turns. When tools do their work, people sleep. Flour, the resinous tops, belongs to the hour's pain outshouts everything. Burned on stones, warmed in oil, crumbled into milk, it moves quick where breath carries it, steadier where fat and spice slow it. This is the plant's sharp edge, the part communities regulate hardest. The rules rise from experience, not before the ridge. Never for the watch, small at first, always with someone who can steady you. And for the widow, the soldier, the midwife after a long night. Yes, when needed. In clinics, flour becomes dosage and mixture. In tents, it becomes a rhythm of shared breath so the strongest don't drift and the hurting aren't alone. What's striking is how ancient people handled the overlap. They didn't split the plant into good and bad so much as assign context. The same stalk making rope also signals harvest for seed. The same plant that warms a brazier also feeds a lamp with oil pressed from seed cake. One species, 3 lifelines, braided through work and rest. If authorities banned anything, it was rarely the rope. The pattern shows up in edicts and customs. Tax the fiber, tolerate the seed, watch the flower. Ban the joy, keep the utility. People adapted. A sailor rubbed tincture into his wrists without calling it pleasure. A monk turned seed into a sleep draught without calling it vice. A caravan guard waited until dawn to accept a pipe because his rules were older than fashion. Climate sharpened choices. In salty air, fiber mattered most. In cold, high valleys, resin held its power in small, dense bundles. Seeds eased dry lungs. In river kingdoms, oil lamps burned seed-derived fuel, while ointments moved across skin like a second light. Communities learned which face of the plant to lean on and when. You can see it in burial kits. A coil of cord placed beside a brazier. A bowl for seeds alongside a pouch for resin. Tools for a journey, not symbols for a debate. Micro-stories thread the 3 into one. A sailor lashes a torn sail at dusk with hemp line, rubs a little resin oil into a knuckle split by cold, swallows a spoon of seed porridge, and sleeps to the slap of waves he no longer dreads. A midwife ties a cord, warms a salve, dabs a tiny resin mixture on a mother's brow, then sips seed tea on a bench before dawn. A herder patches a halter, chews toasted seed against the emptiness of a long ride, and later, when his rib complains, cups smoke in his palms for 3 breaths. No more. Enough to lie down and let sleep come. Our rider understands the calculus without reciting it. Seed for food and a gentle drift toward rest. Fiber for safety and fewer crises. Flower for the nights when the body won't listen to reason. 3 faces of one companion, chosen not by belief but by what the day asks, by what the night demands, and by what tomorrow needs from a body that has to keep going. The fall isn't dramatic. A slip on rhyme, a hoof stutter, a shoulder slam against packed earth. He lies still until the cold asks its question. Ribs answer first, a dull throb deep right, the kind that will argue with breath by sundown. He stands slow, checks the mare's legs, feels the sting wake along his side. Wind scours the grass flat, clouds thin to hammered tin. He rides shorter hours, counting the beats that stab. By late light he chooses a fold where the hill breaks the wind and the snow barely holds. The ground is iron hard. He walks the horses until steam fades, stakes them in a lee, and shrugs the saddle down with a wince he refuses to voice. His hands fumble at the girth, then steady. Cold makes men clumsy if they let it. He won't. Hunger argues with pain. He boils millet, eats the small bowl standing, and feels it drop like a stone into a belly, tight with guarding. He drinks the last of the broth, swallows air that bites, and knows the night is long unless he changes the terms. He takes the pouch from the saddlebag, the one stitched tight with sinew so seeds don't leak, the smaller twist of cloth for the tops. He has enough for winter if he treats winter like a ledger. The brazier is a shallow bowl, dented from years and stones. He clears a ring where grass shows through frost, lifts his cloak to make a wall against the wind, and kneels. Flint, steel, patience. A spark sips at dung and dry grass, grows to a coal he nurses until it's the size of a fist. He adds a few stones from the stream bed, black and wet on the underside. They sweat and then hold heat. Pain has a rhythm. He knows it. He means to change it. First the seed, because the body answers to food and smoke differently. A pinch scatters across the stones with a quiet hiss. The scent comes nut bitter, familiar as rope and harness. He cups his hands, catches the first curl, and breathes it in with a slow count to keep the cough away. 3 breaths, then wait. Hunger loosens by a degree, shoulders drop a finger's width. He touches the cloth pouch the way a man checks the last coin. He opens it just enough and takes what his rules allow, less than the pain demands, more than pride would permit. Crushed tops, resin sticky even in this cold, sprinkled with a care born of need. The smoke turns sweet and a little sharp. He closes his eyes to keep tears from the wind and breathes on the count he's learned from funerals and storms. In 4, pause, out, 6. Pain keeps time with breath whether you ask it to or not. He teaches it a new song. The horses settle first. Ears that flickered at every gust now angle toward him and stay, their breath plume steady. He hears hooves shifting slow, not anxious. He keeps the brazier under his cloak's edge, feeds it just enough to hold a small glow. No one far away will see this. This is medicine, not signal. When the sting in his ribs argues, the smoke answers, not now, later. He knows the cost of too much. He's watched men soften the wrong hour and make hard work harder. He's buried friends who let warmth turn into carelessness on ridges where only iron minds live. So he tests his footwork by standing and stepping a half moon around the brazier, counting, keeping balance. When he sways, he stops and waits until he doesn't. The plant is a partner if you lead. If you don't, it leads you nowhere good. Breath by breath, the edge sands down. Not gone, he won't trust gone, but rounded so the air can come without catching. He wedges a rolled felt under his side where it barks at movement and feels the bargain hold. He rubs a little oil from seed cake into his hands, the kind he keeps for leather and knuckles, and works the heat into the skin until sensation changes from knife to dull weight. There's a watch to keep, winter or not. He walks the line between stakes and listens. Snow ticks, a fox's shadow pencils the ridge. The world is small and entirely enough. When he returns to the brazier, he lets it die to ash, then covers the bowl. He lays his bed beside the mare's, back to their heat, cloak heavy, hat brim low. He tucks the pouches back into the saddlebag by touch. No ceremony, just habit. Sleep comes like a horse, you know. Not on the first whistle, not if you chase it, but willing when you make the field quiet. He feels the mind's march begin, the one that reviews the fall, the route, the debts, and then feels it lose interest. The plant keeps the first watch. He takes the second if needed. Tonight it isn't. Breath finds a pace that doesn't wake his ribs. Snow grinds against the hill in a voice too soft to worry. The last thought that holds before the dark is inventory. Seed enough, tops enough. Winter long, but not endless. In the morning, frost has drawn lace on the saddle. He wakes without the flinch he expected. The herd is there, but it's the kind you can negotiate with, not the kind that dictates terms. He rubs the mare's neck, checks the girth, and tests a deep breath the way a man tests ice. Carefully, it holds. Miles return to the day like birds to a field after a storm. He eats, he packs, he throws the saddle with a grunt that's more habit than pain. And when he rides out, he sets his jaw and smiles at no one. The ledger balances for now. The small fire earned its place. Relief changes behavior. That's the quiet reason rulers, priests, and guilds kept watching the small fire. When pain eases and sleep arrives on time, people need fewer intermediaries. A man who can settle his own nerves after a funeral doesn't linger at a priest's door as often. A woman whose night cough quiets with a seed draft asks less of a physician she can't afford. Autonomy is good for families and sometimes awkward for institutions. whose power rests on being the only bridge between suffering and ease. Ritual made the question louder. Smoke and cups created circles outside official walls, tents, courtyards, back rooms, where grief, endurance, and rest were handled in company that chose itself. Those circles built trust sideways. A caravanserai's unwritten rules could rival a magistrate's announcement because men slept better under rules they made together. Authorities understood that. They didn't need to ban relief to feel uneasy about who hosted it. So regulations split the plant the way practice already had. Fiber and seed went to the taxman. Rope could be weighed, stamped, assessed. Oil could be levied, tallied, and praised in public as national usefulness. Flour and resin moved into codes about public order. The same edict that required hemp for ships' rigging might forbid gatherings with smoke after dark. The line wasn't moral clarity so much as administrative comfort. Keep the utility, watch the joy. Guilds and courts turned that instinct into procedure. Rules read like sayings. No draft before the loom, none for the watch, none in the forge. Enforcement sat with fines, lost apprenticeships, and the quiet humiliation of sweeping floors for a month. The point wasn't punishment, it was predictability. A weaver deadened by resin-spoiled cloth. The night guard softened by smoke made alleys unsafe. Communities wrote control into the hours, not as theology, but as scheduling. Priesthoods had their own calculus. Incense in temples framed official time. Unofficial smoke suggested parallel rites. That's why you see compromises, hashish dens shut on holy days, private use tolerated if doors stayed shut, oils blessed when labeled medicine, but scorned when laughter rose too loud. Public mercy needed to be traceable to altars. Private mercy had to keep its voice down. People obliged when the bargain felt fair. Taxation added another layer. Resin resisted neat ledgers. Seed and fiber fed them. States therefore built economies on hemp's visible forms and treated the invisible forms as a leak. Crackdowns often sounded fiscal. Confiscations counted as revenue. Licenses appeared and vanished. Fines padded budgets more than souls. When winter bit hard and tempers ran hot, the same officials who raided rooms at noon bought salve at dusk for their own needs. Control, not abstinence, sat on the throne. Fear traveled with myth. Stories about herb-fueled conspirators justified raids. Poems about saintly use softened edges. Most people lived between. They wanted rules that kept streets quiet and left kitchens alone. So the compromise hardened into a pattern you can trace from Pamir braziers to port cities. Regulate the public, tolerate the private, and call it virtue when it keeps the peace. Why did sleep draw so much attention? Because sleep sets the clock that sets the market. Authorities care about dawn. If a plant helps a laborer meet dawn ready, it's a friend. If it keeps him from his post, it's an enemy. That's why the same governor who banned smoke after noon paid bonuses in seed oil to crews hauling river stones. He was paying for punctuality disguised as balm. Ritual outside official walls worried hierarchy for another reason. It taught people to self-govern. Burying a friend with shared smoke, timing a cup to watch rotations, setting group rules like none for the scout. These practices trained judgment. Institutions preferred training to come with uniforms. They didn't always stamp it out. They tried to pull it inside. You see it when temples absorb popular rites, when city councils license establishments that already function like clinics for tired men, when physicians write recipes the midwives already know and call them theirs. The plant's flexibility complicated control. Ban rope and commerce breaks. ban seed and kitchens revolt. Ban flour loudly and people get quieter, not compliant. The easiest lever was stigma. Attach shame to visible pleasure. Sanctify visible work. Label everything else for the sick and inspect the sick. The tactic worked until pain outnumbered clerks. Then lenience returned with new signatures. Micro-stories show the hinge. A dockside constable finds a tavern for smoky laughter at noon, then comes back off duty to buy oil for his shoulder. A bishop sermonizes against dens and writes the guild for more bell rope. A judge throws out charges against a widow caught with a seed jar and lectures the arresting officer about his own late rent. Control waivers where reality stands. Our rider knows none of the edicts by name. He feels their weight in rules that make sense. No ember on a ridge, and in rules that don't. No ember in a storm, when warmth might save a hand. He keeps his fire small and his pouches wrapped tight because he understands the real contract. Handle relief with respect, and most powers will look away. Turn it into spectacle, and someone will make an example. Between those poles, sleep remains possible, and that more than law or sermon keeps the road open. When stories fade, objects keep talking. Burial after burial repeats the same quiet inventory. A brazier, a pouch, stones blackened by heat, a small tent frame disassembled for travel to the next world. In kurgans from the steppe, the kits sit within arm's reach of the dead, as if the last night needed to be reconstructed whenever the soul stirred. Copper censers are scarred on the inside, their bowls glazed with soot where seed first hissed. Then resin sweetened the air. Fur bags still cradle desiccated achines, the little shells intact enough to rattle when an archaeologist lifts them. A simple grammar emerges: fire, vessel, fuel, shelter, the components of measured relief. Chemistry reads what eyes can't. Scraped residues from braziers at high altitude cemeteries carry signatures that match THC and its kin, degraded but unmistakable. Gas chromatography traces peaks like heartbeats on paper. The numbers don't make claims about euphoria. They confirm that psychoactive smoke was there, dense enough to bind to wood grain and stone pores for 2,500 winters, strong enough that when a lab warms a fleck, the room's air briefly remembers a funeral on the Pamir Plateau. At lower elevations, the same method pulls quieter profiles, more seed oils, less resin, used consistent with food, salve, lamp. Across regions, the plots don't shout, they align. Pollen tells a wider story, a dust diary that drifts into graves on wind and settles in soil layers like pages. Under microscopes, cannabis pollen grains sit among grasses and grains, their distinctive spines edging a globe. Their presence doesn't prove smoke, it proves proximity. Fields nearby, processing on site, bundles opened where people prepared bodies or camped. In some mounds, pollen spikes correspond with trichomes, those tiny resin glands trapped in crevices of cloth and wood. Fiber imprints show up too, ghost lattices pressed into pottery as wet clay met cord. The plant's three faces leave three kinds of trace: a chemical whisper, a microscopic thorned bead, a fabric shadow. Graves sort themselves by status, and patterns emerge without needing to guess character. Elites lie with gold and with better tools, carved wooden braziers, fine screens to keep embers from flaring, metal tongs for stones. Common graves echo them in simpler materials. A rough bowl, a pile of heat-marked pebbles, a pouch stitched from hide. Access wasn't equal, but intent rhymed. In the Altai, a woman preserved by ice rests with a container of cannabis set by her side. The choice suggests continuity of care, hints at pain met in life and planned for in death. In Pamir tombs, the highest THC residues cluster where other wealth clusters. Ceremony gathered stronger smoke. Everyday life kept milder comforts. The repetition of the kit matters. One mound could be a curiosity. Dozens across distances become a practice. Braziers recur in contexts that read as funerary, but also in caches that look domestic. Camp debris carefully buried or abandoned in haste. Censors appear in both male and female burials, undercutting stories that confine ritual to one gender. Tent frames, dismantled arcs and poles point to enclosed spaces where breath and heat could build. You can see the choreography. Stones heated, seeds thrown first, tops later, people entering, breathing together, then disassembling the scene so nothing dangerous smolders after the living leave. Meanwhile, residue tells parts of what they used but not how much. Doses don't survive. Ratios blur. We can't know whether a princess held a handful or a pinch, whether a widower lingered in a tent or ducked in and out, whether a guard abstained all week and only joined after the body was lowered. The archive under our feet is precise about material and vague about experience. It sketches tools and leaves feelings in the past where they happened. Still, some impacts print themselves. Bones bear stress lines that eased with rest. Dental wear shifts in populations that added soft seed gruel to hard grain. Soot patterns inside tents show restricted burns, the hallmark of control. In places where THC signatures run higher, you also see musical instruments with drums stretched just so, suggesting rhythmic accompaniment to smoke. A ritual isn't proven by a pipe, but tools like to gather in families. Across the web of trade, the same elements meet foreign companions. At one site, silk threads lie near a wooden bowl stained dark with resin, China's touch on a mountain grave. At another, glass beads from far west rest beside a fur bag of seed, a caravan's memory. The plant moves with people who already carry the world's edges in their pockets. It shows up where migrations leave isotopes in teeth, where diet shifts announce new routes. Relief is part of what travels, a reliable piece of home that turns any campsite into a familiar room. In a museum drawer, label stack, charred seed, brazier fragment, censer interior scrapings, pollen slide. Together, they write a sentence simple as a lullaby. They made small fires and breathed easier. The earth doesn't tell us their words, but it holds their means, and that is enough to say this much with confidence. The plant wasn't rumor. It was equipment. It was packed, unpacked, lit, and shared. It helped the living endure and accompanied the dead. The kit repeats, because the need did. A woman steps out of the tent last, her hair still clinging to the scent of burned seed and sweet resin. The mound behind her is new, the earth raw. She is a Scythian widow, and grief has been holding her jaw shut for days. Inside the small funeral tent, stones glowed red, and the brazier breathed like a quiet animal. She didn't wail. She breathed slow and even, as smoke curled under the felt roof. For the first time since the fall from the horse, her chest loosened. The world didn't brighten, it softened. Outside now, the wind feels less like a blade. She ties the stallion's lead rope to a stake, rests her forehead against the warm neck, and lets a single sob pass through. That's all. One. That night she sleeps the way a camp sleeps when a watch is well chosen. In a town beyond the mountains, a Chinese surgeon warms a brazier beside a low bench. The patient, a farmer whose forearm snapped under a fallen beam, sits with teeth set. The surgeon doesn't promise miracles. He lifts a small cup to the patient's lips, an infusion with measured strength, and waits until breath lengthens and shoulders fall a fraction. Then his fingers work, steady and sure, bones coaxed into alignment while the body's alarm is damped rather than drowned. Cloth strips dipped in an herb blend wrap the splint, their scent faintly green beneath smoke. Later the man lies on a pallet, pain present but polite. He closes his eyes and misses nothing of the morning except the panic he doesn't need. Down the Nile, a midwife stands in a narrow room where shutters hold back noon. A woman labors, sweat shining at her temples, fear flickering in her eyes when the wave crests. The midwife warms a thin oil in a clay bowl and rubs it low, firm circles that meet the muscles where they fight themselves. The sting doesn't vanish, it changes shape. A rhythm returns. The midwife keeps time with her hand and a quiet voice that never rises. Hours later, mother and child doze in turns. A few drops massaged into sore hips invite the first deep hour. In the courtyard, the sun leans west. In the room, time finally stops counting. On a cold stone floor in a Sufi lodge, a dervish sits cross-legged with palms open. The long day's hunger makes the body loud. A companion warms a pinch of resin on a coal, the smallest smoke shared among men who will chant for an hour. It doesn't send them elsewhere. It lowers the room's hum until breath and name fall into step. The dervish feels his ribs loosen. The ache in his knees release its grip. When the chant ends, he sweeps the courtyard, eats bread dipped in lentils, and sleeps without the sharpness that used to wake him when winter pressed close. Under hemp sails that have seen 3 storms, a sailor's hands look older than his face. Tar stains the creases. Rope has made its map across his palms. In a port where gulls sound like argument, he pays 2 coins to a woman whose basket smells of mint and something darker. She hands him a small jar the color of late river water. That night, in the forecastle, he rubs the oil into the meat of his thumbs, across the ache in his right wrist, and along the tendon that catches when he coils lines. The ship rocks, his breath follows. Laughter above fades to a smear, then to nothing. He dreams of shore and wakes before bells without the usual curse. A caravan guard, back bowed by the day's saddle, leans against a courtyard wall in Merv. Around him, merchants bargain softly. Beyond, camels complain. He keeps the watch from dusk to midnight, so he drinks tea and refuses a coal held out by a friend. When the shift passes to the next man, he takes his turn. 3 slow breaths over a brazier in a dark corner. The noise steps back. The pack of small worries, maps, debts, stones in tomorrow's path, stops nipping. He stretches on a rolled rug, one arm under his head, and drops into a sleep deep enough to hear the drum at the gate when it sounds. In a timbered village far north, a woman who has buried 1 child and carried another to term sits by a hearth that spits more than it warms. Nights have been a wheel of thoughts she can't get out from under. Her sister visits with a little tin, a salve that smells of beeswax in the hedge. They don't call it by name. She dabs it at her temples and breathes the smoke from a twist of stalk that flares and dies quickly. The house keeps its secrets. Outside, the road is mud. Inside, the clock in her chest slows, enough that sleep finds her before the cock calls. These are not miracles. They're competence, shared and remembered. A plant the color of fields entering lives not as spectacle, but as a way to get through the next thing without breaking. A widow unclenches her jaw. A bone is set before pain turns to terror. A mother's breath finds its count. A devotee keeps vigil without the body's chatter drowning the prayer. A sailor's hand stops shouting long enough for rest to do its work. A guard measures duties with a line even his worry obeys. A sister brings a salve, and grief shifts from storm to weather. Tomorrow, the road resumes. Tonight, the small fire stands watch. Traders didn't need soldiers to move this plant. They needed roads, mouths, and nights that were too long for comfort. Demand ran ahead of doctrine. A man with sore knees in one valley asked a passing driver what worked on the last pass. The answer wasn't a creed. It was a pouch and a way to breathe. From there, the path widened, market to market, camp to camp, a slow river that didn't flood but never dried. Cargo lists told the truth more plainly than edicts. Bales of hemp fiber sat in the open, stamped and taxed. Small jars of oil rode under them, wrapped in cloth that smelled of kitchen and clinic. Resin cakes traveled buried in dates, tucked in with spices, declared as for travel. The risk wasn't worth it unless the need was real. It was. Sleep makes caravans punctual. Pain relief makes walls climbable and winters survivable. People paid for punctual and survivable long before they paid for novelty. Knowledge was the real payload. A Kashgar host taught a Samarkand guest to crush a crumb into milk with cardamom so the stomach wouldn't complain. A Sogdian showed a Chinese merchant how to warm stones and throw seeds first, tops later, so the throat didn't seize. An Egyptian sailor rubbed a joint with green oil and taught a Genoese deckhand to do the same before the rope work doubled. These were tiny lessons with outsized returns. Less coughing, fewer mistakes, more mornings that began without a fight inside the skull. Local practices shaped the plant to the place. In oases where dates grew sweet, resin slipped into confections that traveled better in heat. In wet ports, seed oil became lamp fuel and salve. The smoke kept to back rooms after the nets were hung. In high valleys, the air and sun made resin stronger. People responded by shrinking portions and lengthening pauses. Climate, elevation, and work schedules wrote the rules. You can see it in the tools that moved with it. Some towns favored braziers and screens, others mortars and cloth filters, others nothing but a hot stone and a cupped hand. Language spread without trumpets. Words shed consonants and picked up vowels as they crossed borders. Kanab, kunabu, hashish. The meaning stayed near relief and ritual, not rebellion. Guild charters adopted borrowed terms to be precise about what an apprentice could touch and when. Apothecaries kept notes in two scripts when customers needed reading from both sides of a street. Names changed, the timing didn't. Never before the watch, never on the ridge, never alone when the mind is heavy. No empire had to bless this. Hemp's fiber conquered by usefulness, its seed by gentleness, its flower by measured mercy. States tried to corral the parts they could count. Rope production was ordered and inspected because ships sank without it. Seed oil was levied because lamps must burn. Resin refused the ledger and therefore collected stories instead. Some of those stories were cautionary, told by officials looking for causes when order cracked. Most were practical, recipes, half jokes about snoring cured, advice about how to keep a man honest on guard. The quiet globalization of comfort worked because the plant solved recurring problems better than the alternatives at hand. Snow and salt eat wood and will. Hemp fiber ignores both. Stomach knots and night terrors aren't impressed by speeches. Seed gruel and a shared ember are. Migrants carry cuttings and seed the way they carried songs and superstitions. A family leaving a mountain kept a little pouch because it made grandfather sleep and babies stop crying sooner. Their neighbors noticed asked, and then asked again in the next town. Portability mattered. Resin's density turned a field into a thumb-sized ration book. Seed hardness made medicine storeroom stable. Fiber's lifespan made trade dependable. Together, they created habit. Habit created expectation. Expectation created markets that didn't advertise, just waited. A caravan arriving after dusk could count on someone knowing where to find warmth for rope-burned hands and a draft that brought morning faster. A ship's crew, new to a coast, could walk 2 streets inland and find a woman who knew how to mix her oil for wrists, not accustomed to that harbor's work. Meanwhile, belief systems absorbed what fit and released what didn't. Some temples folded herb scent into incense on mourning days and called it care. Others forbade smoke inside walls and allowed it outside at wakes, drawing a line that felt like cleanliness. In both cases, the practice continued. It didn't need a pulpit. It needed pain to show up at dusk, which it always did. A last detail traveled as reliably as any bell. Etiquette. Everywhere the plant went, it came with rules that made it safer. First water the animals. First see to the fire's safety. First count the hours. Share, but don't insist. Hold back when fear must stay bright. These rules required no translation. They rode in gestures. A palm turned down to refuse a coal offered low, a finger raised to say, later. In that language, the plant crossed continents without ever raising its voice. It made nights bearable, dawns possible, and journeys something a body could attempt again. Names came first. People rarely carry a tool this long without giving it a personality. On the step, the plant was the thing that warmed grief, the friend of the tent. In Chinese texts, Ma sat among staples and medicines, a character sketched with the same brush as everyday necessities, but spoken of with a hint of balance, cooling here, enlivening there. In India's hymns, it was a gift tied to a god who knew something about endurance. In market towns along rivers, it earned nicknames that sounded like favors repaid: sleep bringer, knee helper, night quiet. Stories gathered around it not because the plant needed temples, but because people needed reasons. A youth learns that his grandmother kept a pouch not to abandon pain, but to bargain with it. The story becomes a family rule. A Sufi calls it the green friend, and then reminds his students not to visit friends when they should be at work. A sailor swears that a dab of oil kept his hands from betraying him in a squall. His shipmates laugh and ask for the recipe. The plant becomes a companion, useful, flawed, predictable if you respect it, dangerous if you don't. Communities made rituals that were less about the herb than about each other. Shared tents after burials, cups passed at dusk before a hard ride tomorrow. A rule that the one with watch abstains and the one with fresh loss takes the first breath. These weren't superstitions. They were agreements that made the plant part of a social fabric. You can see it in small gestures. A coal lifted just high enough to invite, lowered enough to let a refusal land without offense. Meaning lives in those negotiations. Grief pulled it close. Across cultures, mourners used measured smoke or drink to soften the first edges so the rest of the village could keep moving. That's not forgetfulness, that's maintenance. A community that lets its mourners sleep keeps its carts rolling and its tempers from snapping. The plant made that possible without demanding a festival. It asked for a brazier, a handful, a time limit, and the presence of someone who would put a hand on your shoulder if you drifted. Passage rights gave it other jobs. A boy riding his first solo watch took seed gruel in the afternoon to settle a stomach that fluttered. A girl entering a craft tasted a spice milk with a trace of resin and listened to her aunt's instructions about patience and counting. A craftsman finishing a long commission accepted a shared ember not as reward but as re-entry into ordinary time after weeks of narrowed focus. In all of these, the plant marked thresholds the way a rope marks a boundary. Flexible, visible, not meant to bind, meant to guide. Ethics clung to it because ethics cling to anything that shifts experience. Rules grew like hedges. Don't use it to avoid duties. Bring it when someone else hurts. Refuse it when fear needs to be kept bright for safety. Share it when the group is tired and has earned a night that doesn't scrape. Those hedges tell you what people thought the plant was for. Not escape, not bravado, not spectacle. Companionship in hard weather. Language kept reinforcing that role. Poems called it a lamp inside the ribs, a rope over a dark stream, a cushion laid between bone and ground. Proverb makers sharpened the other edge. Smoke hides a hole only until you step in it. Milk sweetened too much spoils the next day. The plant story stayed human-sized, free of miracles, anchored in competence and restraint. In kitchens and clinics, meanings settled into routines. The seed jar on a shelf near lamps meant there would be light and gentle medicine through winter. The fiber drying under eaves meant rope in spring and sails repaired before storm season. The little wrapped bundle at the back of a drawer meant a household had a plan for nights when pain refused the usual bargains. That bundle made people braver about facing tomorrow because they knew they didn't have to do it empty. Companionship is mutual. People carried the plant across ridges and borders. The plant carried people through seasons and losses. It's telling that so many burial kits include it, not because the dead would use it, but because the living needed to know they had sent their own with something familiar. A last gesture. Here is warmth. Here is breath made easier. Go. Our writer would call none of this philosophy. He would call it sense. He names the plant by its jobs: rope, seed, tops, and by its timing. Now, later, not tonight. He thanks it without prayer, with habit instead. Small fire, counted breath, no ember left alive when he sleeps. Meaning, for him, is that miles are possible, and grief doesn't break the axle. That's a companion's work, and in the quiet between hoofbeats, he knows the plant will keep doing it as long as people keep listening to their own rules. Rumor travels faster than any caravan. Along the same roads that carried rope and salve, a story hardened into a warning label. Men drugged on resin, blades bright, obeying a master from a mountain eyrie. Hashish made them fearless, said the tale. Intoxication made them loyal. It was tidy, frightening, and useful to repeat. The sect existed. The Nizari Ismailis held fast in stone nests like Alamut, and they did remove rivals with precision. But the resin explanation did heavy lifting their own planning already covered. Contemporary enemies needed a reason for being outfoxed that wasn't "we were outmaneuvered." So Hashishin slid into chronicles, a smear that made skill sound like stupefaction. Language did the rest. Centuries later, Assassin echoes the slur more than the facts. What nobody knew at the time or admitted was that the herb's real role on those roads was the opposite of frenzy. It was evening, not charge. Our courtyards and tents tell that. The etiquette: no smoke before a watch, none before a climb. Measure always collides with the myth's picture of men stumbling into danger with dulled judgment. Courage on a cliff comes from clear feet, we heard in caravanserais, not softened knees. The rumor asked people to forget what they saw every night. Resin bringing sleep, not delirium. so dawn could be met with steady hands. Why did the myth stick? Because stories that police behavior love villains with props. They're reusable. A ruler can point to a den and say, "There lies the seed of treachery," even while his own surgeons keep jars for pain. Fear simplifies. It turns a plant with 3 faces, fiber, seed, flower, into a single mask, then warns children about it. It makes public crackdowns legible and private exceptions excusable. It lets an edict say, "Ban the joy, keep the utility," without naming the bargain. Words migrated as fast as goods. Hashish became a byword for excess in one city and remained a kitchen remedy in another. In ports, sailors laughed at the assassin tale. They knew the line between oil for wrists and smoke for spectacle. In lodges, dervishes passed a coal after zikr, not before. In courts, jurists split hairs between medicine and intoxication with care born of experience. The rumor lived anyway, because it served embarrassment. Kings preferred drugged daggers to admitting a letter, a bribe, or a better map had undone them. The cost wasn't just semantic. Suspicion followed ordinary people. A widow with a seed jar learned to hide it deeper. A craftsman waited until shutters closed to rub his balm. The plant kept doing its small work, but under a louder story. Even now, when the word assassin is said, a thin smoke rises in the mind that doesn't belong to funerals or clinics. It belongs to a mountain fable. The graves and braziers under the earth tell a quieter truth. The herb endured not as spell or weapon, but as a companion that helped people sleep and stand. An easy thing to miss, if you prefer myths that shout. Some plants arrive with fanfare and vanish with fashion. This one survived dynasties, deserts, and doctrines because it solved more than one problem at once. When people weighed what to pack for a winter, a voyage, a war, they chose things that did 3 jobs, not 1. Hemp did 3 without arguing. First, it grew where life was already hard. Low input, fast to root, tolerant of poor soils and fickle rain, it didn't demand a priesthood of farmers to coax it from the ground. A family moving between valleys could scatter seed along river margins and expect stalks tall enough by season's turn to matter. In salt air, it stood. In thin mountain light, it thickened resin. In damp river kingdoms, it gave oil when lamps needed feeding. Other herbs promised relief but sulked in strange climates. This one traveled like a mule, stubborn, dependable, unimpressed by terrain. Second, it carried itself well. Portability is the difference between a cure remembered and a cure left behind. Seeds stored like grain and behaved like medicine. Fiber braided into rope that outlived storms. Resin condensed miles of field into a thumb-size ration. Traders favored tools that shrank without losing function. Resin does that, seeds do that, many plants gave comfort at home. Few consented to be folded into a pouch and still work on a ridge in sleet. Third, its effects fit the clock of work. A plant that demanded a day for visions didn't help a shepherd who had a watch at dusk and a march at dawn. Measured smoke worked in minutes and wore off by morning if you respected the count. Seed calmed and nourished without tangling thought. Oil massaged into joints helped hands without stealing judgment. Communities learned to time it, and timing is the secret language of survival. Herbs that ignored the schedule fell out of kits. This one learned it with them. It was flexible in culture as well as body. Sacred where songs needed it. Medicinal where ledgers watched it. Mundane where ropes were weighed. That hybrid life, temple, clinic, workshop, protected it from single front attacks. Ban incense, rope remains, tax oil, salve stays in kitchens, glare at laughter. Grey jars in infirmaries keep their place on shelves. A plant that can wear 3 uniforms isn't easy to draft into a war against itself. It also taught restraint by being predictable when respected. People like companions whose rules they can memorize. Don't take it on a ridge. Don't touch it before a watch. Share when grief is fresh. With other herbs, lines were fuzzy. With this one, communities wrote proverbs that held. Predictability breeds trust. Trust breeds persistence. A plant that surprises you at the wrong hour loses friends. This one earned them. Agronomy helped. Quick harvest cycles meant it could slot between staples. Cut fiber early, let seed finish later, take tops when storms whisper. A field could be 3 things in 1 year without exhausting soil. That's a kind of mercy for land and people. Crops that insisted on single use and single season asked too much of thin calendars. Hemp fit into the margins, and margins are where most survival happens. Trade networks loved its math. Rope made ships possible. Ships made trade possible. Trade carried seed. Seed grew more rope. Positive feedback without needing a king to bless it. Resin rode hidden on those same hulls, paying for passage with sleep in hammocks that hung under hemp sail. A commodity that creates its own road tends to outlast laws. This one kept building roads out of fiber and custom. Compare it quietly to other comforts. Alcohol stores well and speaks fast, but steals mornings and eats grain needed for bread. Opium quiets pain, but slows whole villages when doses creep. Exotic incense soothes minds, but empties purses and requires caravans to risk too much for scent. Hemp's balance, gentle seed, strong rope, measured resin, asked for less sacrifice. It's hard to outlaw a thing that keeps ships afloat and lets the watch wake on time. Authorities, for their part, learned to live with it because it answered their needs too. Armies marched under hemp banners and slept under hemp cloth. They strung bridges and crossbows with it. Administrators lit offices with seed oil and wrote on paper made smoother by hemp fiber. Judges slept better with salve on knees than with proclamations alone. Even when they frowned at smoke, they accepted the plant's other faces. That institutional ambivalence is a form of protection. It endured because it belonged to ordinary competence. You didn't need a specialist to use it. A mother could toast seed without a recipe. A rider could make a brazier from a bowl and stones. A sailor could coil a rope by feel. A dervish could count breaths. The plant's instructions traveled in gestures and sayings, not in scripts that needed schools. Tools that democratize care survive. Meanwhile, the graves kept restocking the argument. Every time a brazier and seed pouch turned up under earth, people in the present could point and say, "This is older than your rule." Continuity shields practice. When a remedy is new, it's easy to brand it threat. When it has been sitting in kitchens and tents since grandmother's grandmothers, bans sound temporary, even when written in stone. Our rider would list simpler reasons. It grew where he rode. It fit in a pouch. It worked fast and left him clear by dawn. When he respected it, it stitched his nights to his days without tearing either. Plenty of plants offered a single kind of help. This one kept showing up where the rope met the sail, where the seed met the spoon, where the ember met the breath. That's why it's here. Still in the ledger, still in the small fire, still in the rules that let hard worlds become bearable for another mile. Age has thinned his hands but steadied his rules. The old rider moves like someone who has rehearsed every winter and knows which shortcuts tempt disaster. Late light lies low on the grass, a dull gold that makes the frost look friendly from a distance. It isn't. His mare flicks an ear without bothering to lift her head. Trust takes that shape after decades. Quiet, efficient, free of ceremony. He rides until the air turns from cold to metallic. That's the hour when hunger sharpens and judgment dulls. He turns off the main track to a shallow fold he's used for years, the kind that breaks the wind without collecting snow. There's an old fire scar here under the tussock, barely darker than the earth. He's the only one who remembers it. He's also the only one who needs to. He pickets the mare and the pack horse in the lee, checks hooves by habit, then rubs her jaw where the bit sits all day. The mare leans into his palm, and that small weight on his hand is a kind of approval. He sets the saddle on a low rock, not on wet ground. Little courtesies prevent big problems. The same rule governs everything else. The brazier rides where it always has, a dented bowl inside a cloth roll, nested with the same small kit. Flint, steel, a twist of dry moss, and 2 pouches, one heavy with seed, one lighter and tied twice. He counts supplies without counting, fingers reading level like a miller reading grain. There's enough. There's enough because he's treated it like a ledger since his black hair turned grey. He eats first, always. A handful of toasted millet softened with the last of the morning broth. A slice of dried meat, water warm to keep it from biting. The food lands steady. Hunger is a loud liar. The body listens if you feed it before you negotiate with pain. Only then does he open the seed pouch and pinch a measure into his palm. He could cook it into porridge. Tonight, he wants the warmth faster. Seeds hiss when they meet the hot stones, the sound small and friendly. He lifts his cloak against the wind and gathers the scent with both hands, breathing in on a slow 4 and out on a longer 6. The rhythm he taught himself years ago in a tent after a burial, when quiet was the only kindness left. The ache lives in his lower back today, not sharp, just persistent. The way old iron complains when asked for 1 more mile. The first breaths take the edge off. He waits. Waiting is the whole trick and the hardest part. He checks the horses again, runs a palm down a fetlock, checks the knots, walks far enough from the fire that any ember could be seen. There aren't any. The bowl sits low, the fire inside so modest it barely speaks. When he touches the small pouch, he does it the way he handles money on long roads, sparingly, with respect, never to impress anyone. He opens it and takes a portion, the size his thumb has learned by feel, not to erase, to soften. The first curl of smoke is sweeter, thinner, and he doesn't chase it. He invites it to meet him halfway. 3 breaths, then he waits and walks a half circle to test his feet. Clear. From years of funerals, he knows this. You can weep and still keep watch if you keep count. Wind lifts and lays his cloak like a sleeping animal breathing. He warms a thumbful of oil from the seed cake, what's left after pressing, and works it into the old scars across his knuckles. Then along the line of his back he can reach, the rest with a stick and a cloth. Heat spreads under skin, the way a good idea spreads through a camp, quietly, then everywhere. His jaw unclenches without his noticing it, which is how he knows the balance is right. This is the place where men go wrong. They feel the easing and ask for more. He feels the easing and asks the horses, ears forward, steady chewing, no restlessness. He steps and counts again. No sway. The rule holds. He banks the small ember under the bowl's lip, lifts the edge of his felt, and lets heat stay close, not bright. If anyone were watching from the ridge, they'd see nothing. No one is. He arranges this life so the only witnesses are are the ones he trusts to be bored by it. He lies down with felt rolled under his knees and another under his ribs. Two wedges that turned enemies into neighbors years ago. The mare's warmth on his shoulder is better than any blanket. He tucks the pouches back in their order, seed outside, tops inside, flint wrapped in cloth so it doesn't rattle. He folds his hat brim down against the starlight. The sky is clear enough to make a man feel small. He feels small and pleased by it. Memory visits in fragments as it tends to when the body calms without being dragged. Not faces, not speeches. Hands. His father's teaching him to strike sparks without chasing them. A midwife's hand steadying his wife's wrist between pains. A friend's knuckles on his shoulder outside a funeral tent. A groom's fingers braiding hemp into a halter that never broke. It's all the same story told on different days. Keep the ember small. Share when needed. Count your breath. Leave no heat alive when you walk away. Sleep arrives without drama, which is exactly why he trusts it. No plunge, no vertigo, no dream that starts at a sprint. Just the quiet closing of a gate and the feeling of being inside the fence you meant to build. He misses nothing he needs to hear. The mare shifts. His ear registers it without waking his mind. The wind changes and carries snow. He turns in his sleep and the wedges hold him where pain would have caught him. Dawn doesn't have to break in. It's let in. In the morning, frost has drawn pale veins across the saddle leather. A map of rivers he will never ride. His breath makes brief ghosts in the air. He sits up and waits for the old ache to argue. It does, but with manners. He rolls, stands, and the world doesn't tilt. He scrapes the brazier's bowl with a flat stone until ash looks like nothing and feels like cold. He scatters it wider than any spark's memory. He touches the mare's neck, thanks her out loud because there's no one to laugh and laughs anyway. He eats, he packs, he checks the pouches without looking, and he swings the saddle with a sound that belongs to men who learned to do it before they learned to count. The road runs out of the fold and into the wind. He sets his jaw against the cold and smiles with his eyes. Gratitude is a quiet thing here. No speeches, no vows. Just a plant that kept watch for a night, a small fire that asked nothing, and a body that can face the next miles without bargaining for every breath. The herd will move. The winter will hold. The day will ask what it always asks. He will answer. And tonight, if pain tries to write the script again, he'll open the ledger, strike a match, and balance the line. Empires rise with rules and fall with excuses, but nights don't change. Cold still bites. Backs still throb. Grief still sits heavy and silent. Across centuries, the small fire kept showing up in tents and kitchens long after palace edicts yellowed and cracked. Rope outlived flags. Oil outlived slogans. A shared ember outlived speeches about virtue. The plant didn't argue with power. It waited it out. States tried to rename it, tame it, or ban its more cheerful hours. Yet their ships needed hemp rigging. Their bell towers needed cords that wouldn't rot in fog. Their scribes needed paper that didn't tear in damp. Farmers kept jars of seed where taxes couldn't count, and soldiers rubbed salves into knees before anyone stamped approval on the practice. Officially, incense belonged to temples and clinics. Unofficially, relief belonged to whoever had the sense to prepare for night. What persists isn't rebellion, it's continuity. Women teaching daughters how much seed to toast for sleep after a fever. Men teaching sons to keep embers small and breath even. Healers teaching apprentices to share resins with grief and abstain with fear. The plant moved through families like a recipe you don't write down, because the hand already knows the weight. Empires borrowed names and borders. People borrowed competence. Rope holds more than sails. It holds communities. It stitched markets together, made river trade predictable, let migration feel less like exile and more like a plan. Seed kept lights low and steady in houses that couldn't afford waste. It turned hunger into patience and fear into something the body could negotiate with. Resin measured, managed, turned the first edge of pain so sleep could arrive and tomorrow could be faced without a deficit. Those 3 lifelines did their work no matter which crest hung above the gate. Look closely at the record we can trust. Banners change on mosaics and coins. In the same time, layers, you find cord impressions on pots, pollen in floor dust, braziers with soot, too sweet to be only wood. The loud parts of history, conquest, trials, proclamations, sit beside the quiet parts that actually kept people alive. When you read the ground instead of the archive, the story steadies. Rope, oil, ember, breath. Every authority learned the same lesson sooner or later. Ban the joy, keep the utility. Then discover that joy, handled like craft, carries its own utility too. A laborer who sleeps on schedule is a better citizen than a man who prays louder from exhaustion. A widow who can breathe through a night becomes a neighbor who can carry her share tomorrow. Cities quietly made room for that arithmetic even when sermons wanted to run a surplus of purity. Pragmatism is the state religion that never admits its name. What does it mean then that this one plant followed so many routes and slipped so many nets? It suggests a simpler definition of civilization than marble and law. A civilization is a place where people learn to make pain tolerable, grief bearable, and labor repeatable without breaking hearts or backs. Hemp taught that in 3 languages at once: material, medicinal, social. You could hold it in your hand as a rope, a seed, a pinch. You could hold its rules in your head. After work, not before. For grief, not for boredom. Share, don't insist. There's humility in this endurance, no grand doctrine, no single prophet, just generations of people noticing what worked and teaching it sideways. In that sense, the plant became a companion more than a substance, a memory stored in gestures, the way a coal is offered low, the way a pouch is tied twice, the way someone says, later, you're on watch, with respect instead of scorn. These manners don't look like monuments, but they outlast them. The brief age of prohibition, wherever it took root, sits like a small, loud chapter against a very long book. Laws tried to erase a companion that had already been folded into rope and prayer and porridge. Some laws stuck for a time, many bent under their own contradictions, armies marching under hemp flags, while courts scolded a kitchen jar. Eventually, the old pattern reasserted itself. Regulate what you can count, tolerate what you can't afford to uproot, and trust communities to police the timing better than a clerk ever will. Meanwhile, the rider grows old, a living footnote proving how endurance actually happens. He keeps the rules because they worked before kings changed their minds and will work after. He doesn't need to win an argument with history. He needs to saddle up in the morning with pain that speaks politely. That modest goal is the hinge of the human story. Empires imagine glory. Households measure mercies. If there's a broader meaning, it's this. Comfort isn't decadence when it keeps a body honest to its work. Sleep isn't luxury when dawn decides wages. Relief is an escape when it returns you to your post steadier than before. Cultures that remember that distinction tend to keep moving, no matter who gives the orders from the hill. In that movement, across dust and water and ice, one companion kept saying yes in 3 voices: make, mend, and rest. Long after we forget which ruler banned what, we'll still recognize the sound of seeds hissing on hot stones, the quiet of a brazier under a cloak, the feel of good rope in the hand. Those are the syllables of survival. They've outlived gods and governors, and will likely outlive the stories we're telling now. The plant didn't make people resilient. It made resilience easier to choose. That's enough to grant it a place in the long company we keep when the wind rises and the road keeps going. Across graves and kitchens, the same small fire softened grief, steadied hands, and let travelers close their eyes without fear. If you want more true stories about how ordinary people found rest in hard worlds, subscribe and queue up the next episode. Tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is.